Hi, I'm Anjali Alapat, the host of Arcx, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and science fiction for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape. Doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In Season 3, I'm going to be talking to some wonderful South Asian fantasy, sci-fi, and speculative fiction writers to find out what really made them want to tell stories. We're going to talk about books, movies, TV shows, video games, and other media that shaped and influenced them as writers. Today's guest is award-winning author and journalist Bina Shah. Her first sci-fi novel, Before She Sleeps, was published in 2018, followed by the sequel, The Monsoon War, in 2023. Bina's work explores women's rights, societal issues, technology, education, and freedom of expression. Join us as we discuss grappling with grief through writing, the nuances of feminism, seeing the world through the Western gaze, women in politics, future federations, and AI. Hi, Bina. Thank you so much for joining us today on Arcx.
It's an absolute pleasure for me to be here.
To kind of get things started, I usually ask this question, and how did you get started as a writer? Did you always want to be one?
I did, and I didn't. I did want to be one when I was about 12 or 13, and then I forgot that that's what I wanted to do. And I have diaries from that age where I've written it over and over again. I want to be a writer. I want to be a famous writer. I want to be a writer. And then, you get caught up in everything that you're doing, your schoolwork, your sports, your exams, your friendships, your crushes, your life. And you kind of lose sight of those dreams. And I went off to college and I didn't study writing, but I did writing while I was there. And I kept getting indications that I was good at it. I kept getting encouragement from certain professors. I won a prize here or there that I wasn't expecting to. So something kept telling me, you should write. You need to write. Writing is good. Writing is something you really need to do. And then I lost sight of it again when I moved back from the US to Pakistan. Slowly, gradually, I came around to it eventually. I would say I was 27 or so, 27, 28. And that's when I really decided that this was it for me.
And were there any particular books or movies or shows or something that really influenced you as a storyteller? You kind of picked it up again a bit later in life. So was there anything that you consumed that stayed with you?
Reading had been a constant for me. It's the most important thing that I ever learned to do, I think. I had read at a very young age, I think I was 10, when my mother bought me The Diary of Anne Frank, but she said, you can't read this until you're older. And of course, when her back was turned, I plucked it out of the shopping bag and read it cover to cover in the time that she went to go buy some clothes and come back. And then I just read that book all the time. And then I just really fell in love with the whole idea of Anne and where she was stuck in the secret annex, because that's such a great metaphor for, puberty, adolescence. You're in a secret annex. Everything outside is prepared to destroy you. The people that you live with, your family, you can't trust them. You have to develop this whole secret interior life, which was put down in her diary. And that just appealed to me in such a primal way. I think it just got really infused into me.
And I see a lot of that in your work that I've read, because you do explore the interior stories of women. Do you feel like you've drawn from that book and used it in your own work a lot?
No, not from that book in particular. That book was an inspiration to me as a teenager, as a young girl. But in terms of the stories, the interior stories of women, I think interiority is very central to women's existences, especially in a place like Pakistan, a conservative place where women are not encouraged to lead public lives. They're always cloistered, hidden away in some shape or the other, either by physical segregation or by veiling, parda, the rules that we impose on ourselves about how we should be behaving if we do venture out in public. there's layers of protection and guardianship, and so much so that it can be a very constraining life. So where is the true freedom? The true freedom lies in the mind and what you're thinking and what you're feeling. So I always found that to be such a huge landscape. It's like, you open the closet door to Narnia and it's the whole land is inside there, but nobody else can see it. So it's yours. Nobody has control over that. Whereas in your physical real life, a lot of things have control over you.
Absolutely. I think that really resonates in your writing as well, because from what I've observed, it is very much played out in different ways with different characters, the way the constraints of society hamper both your interior and exterior life. Are there any themes that you would like to explore further in your books? Things that are a bit like Anne Frank's diary, like talking about physical and, environmental constraints and things like that. Are those themes that you feel you'd like to explore further?
I mean, the obvious next book that is begging to be written is probably the third of the series before she sleeps, the Monsoon War, and then blank. And I have no idea what I'm doing for it. Well, I have begun to think about it, but it's just so big. I'm so tired right now that I haven't been able to really get ideas down. So Before She Sleeps was all about patriarchy. And the Monsoon War is very much about when women are leading instead. And the third book, what I feel I want to explore truly is then a sort of cooperation that goes between the sexes. And I can't quite figure out as yet what I want that to look like, but I'm playing with the idea that comes from, I think, some South American sort of sociology about patriarchy versus matriarchy versus alterity, which is, somebody explained it to me as sort of a much more even type of exchange that still takes into account the differences between both the genders and yet accommodates them and arrives at a kind of a consensus solution for how to live. I just really like that idea, and I'm just trying to think, how do I portray that in fiction in a format and in a way that complements what I've already done?
I'm so glad to hear that you're thinking of a third book, because that was going to be one of my questions, because I just feel like there's so much room there for more story, really, because you've left, without giving away too many spoilers, you've left it at a point where they're kind of at a precipice of something very big.
Big.
Yeah. So
if you have any ideas, can you email me later? Because
happy to. We're definitely going to dive into your work. And I'm a big fan of Before She Sleeps. So I was really excited when the Monsoon War came out. And congratulations.
And it's out in paperback in the US, May 7th. So I'm really excited about that too.
That's good to know. And it's a very compelling sequel. And it's a really wonderful expansion of what is already a very fascinating world. And I know we're going to discuss Monsoon War primarily because that's your most recent book. But I do feel like, since they're set in the same world, you have to kind of touch on Before She Sleeps as well. So I think some questions are going to be relevant to both. I wanted to know if you could tell us a bit about how your inspiration for both these books came about and how you went about building this world.
Well, thank you so much for that question. And, when I look back on what I set out to do about 2016, 2017, I just remember how afraid I was, because it was a huge departure for me from the type of work that I'd been doing before, which was sort of contemporary fiction about Pakistan, a little bit of historical fiction, the usual, that horrible first novel that's actually autobiographical and you're supposed to not say that it is, but it is. I got all of that out of my system. And I said everything I wanted to say about Pakistani society and so on and so forth as it is today, or as it was then. I just felt that it was time now to turn my face from the present and the past to the future. The great thing about speculative fiction and dystopia is that it's a stand-in for what you really want to say about the present. But because you're putting it in the future and you're putting it in a different world, in a different context, you have more freedom to say the dangerous things. So I think that was where I was coming from with Before She Sleeps. I was in a very, very difficult place in life at that time. I mean, 2015, if I remember correctly. I lost a very dear friend. Her name was Sabine Mahmoud, and she was just a marvelous person, a friend, and she was the head of a place called the Second Floor, a cultural center. She had done so much to bring life back into the city, which had been really hammered after years of unrest, civil disorder, terrorism, a lot of political ups and downs. And then, unfortunately, in 2015, she was murdered. She was assassinated in a terrorist attack. And that was such a terrible time for all of us. I took all of that grief, all of that pain and anger, and I put it in Before She Sleeps. I wanted to say something about men and women and the way that men and women relate to each other, and the way that men and women relate to each other in the situation of being intimate together, in their talking, in their conversation, in their just the physicality of being together. But those things felt dangerous to say directly. So I had to couch it in such a fantastical, weird, futuristic way. That's how the world of Before She Sleeps was born, really.
I'm so sorry for your loss, but I also see that character as being as so much more real and more dimensional now that I know what the inspiration was.
Well, Sabine the person is nothing like Sabine the character, and I actually named that character much before what happened. But when it happened, then the book took on a different pace. It took on a different need. It was a different need that I was trying to fulfill when I was writing, especially the later parts of the book, which I think have more anguish and more loss and more grief. I was trying to grapple with that in my life, and it was so hard to do. But when I could write it and put it on a page, then it just became manageable. There were many tears shed, though, over that process, at that timeline of writing.
And I think that really shows in the book because one thing I felt about Before She Sleeps, there's a deep sense of grief in it because you realize even this little rebellious life that these women are leading is still such a small anomaly in this larger system, which is just waiting to swoop in and grab them. And on so many levels, they've been failed, even by this little system outside of a system. I found it very touching because I was thinking, like, it's so obvious that you can't think beyond the limits that have already been offered to you. Like, you've grown up in this world, and it's so hard to imagine anything else.
Totally, totally. What you're talking about is that I think the overarching theme of the book, the sadness of it, is the futility of trying to revolt against something where you're doomed to fail just because it's too strong. It's too big, it's too strong, you're too limited, your resources are so few, you're scrabbling for survival. You have to do it in a way that doesn't seem empowered at all. And yet that's still your only area of control.
And I think in the Monsoon War, you're seeing a completely different landscape because in the Green City, that kind of oppression is so close. You know, it's like Big Brother is watching. You are scared of everything and everyone. There is no way to hide from this because everything is complicit. The systems are complicit. There's nobody who's going to protect you. And they show you quite clearly what happens to people who try to evade the system as well. But in the Monsoon War, you're looking at a different terrain where it's mountain villages, where people have devised their own ways of kind of circumventing the system. And they're rebelling in their own, like, small, but obviously very effectual ways. I mean, one of the things I found the most interesting was these different perspectives in both books. In Monsoon War, you get to see a lot of different women from very different times and places in their lives who have all faced the same oppression but have dealt with it very differently.
Yep.
How did you choose to make that the narrative, these differing perspectives?
So Before She Sleeps was very noir, as you pointed out. And the Monsoon War, I wanted the tone to be one of daylight, of dawn, of breaking out of that noir, of coming into your own, and the absolute wildness of freedom that women feel when they are truly free, because it's a completely different feeling. The way that you exist when you're constrained and the way that you exist when there are no constraints. These women make their own rules, especially the ones in the mountain. And before she sleeps, I was looking at a life underground. And here in Monsoon War, I was looking at the life of a distance, of a remote area, of a place that's so remote and so forgotten that the rules are not even applied that much to them. And everything is just really evolved in a different way over there. I really just wanted to make these two worlds so contrastingly that I think the voices of those women in the Monsoon War showed themselves very clearly to me. It was very easy to formulate these characters. They're almost like archetypes in a way. That's why I call, Alia in the beginning, she's the wife, and then there's the commander, and then there's the fighter, and there's the minister or the politician. These are like the archetypes. And these are all women that I have seen in my life in Pakistan. So I think I was really chronicling those kinds of lives and those kinds of aspirations, and at the same time giving them a name and giving them a very specific story and a very specific background. That's all part of the job of the novelist, is really taking the bigger themes and keeping them going while you're also working on a very individual level with each individual person. And it's a lot to juggle.
I really enjoyed kind of the nuances that were represented. Like you said, this is about women, really. So the Monsoon War has a lot of differing perspectives on a woman's agency, identity, what freedom means, what feminism means, even if they're not calling it feminism. And it's a really great example of how all of this means entirely different things to different people. For example, the women on the mountain kind of look at the women from the city as kind of like, oh, they're, overindulged, pampered kind of thing. And they found their own way to kind of circumvent the system, and they don't quite understand why those women are so helpless. And, because they basically, what they do is, instead of admitting to having girl children, they basically just raise them as boys.
No, it's not a spoiler. I'm just joking.
Okay. Oh my God.
Actually, in a previous iteration of the novel, I wanted it to be an absolute spoiler. I didn't want anyone to know, not even the reader. And then my agent read this. She said, you can't do this to your reader. They have to be in on it from the start. I tend to do this writer's tick where I try to have a twist and it never worked. I'm always told, no, lead me gently away from the edge of the cliff and say, no, we're going to do it like this instead. Trust me.
Yeah. And you also see the difference in perspective when, Alia goes with Noor to meet these women, and they find out that Noor is a girl, technically speaking. And they immediately call her a bad mother. And she can't even understand that. She's like, what are you talking about? I have saved my child. I've given my child a choice. And it just shows that everybody's looking at this from such different places, because they've all obviously experienced oppression, but not the same flavor of it, perhaps.
Yeah, because I see this in Pakistan so much that we're all of us women are constrained by patriarchy, misogyny. But instead of finding solidarity in that, we find reasons to fight with each other and pick each other apart based on where you are in class order, in the caste order. Are you from the city? Are you from the village? Are you from the mountains? Are you from where? What's your education level? What language do you predominantly speak? We find all these reasons to stay divided rather than having solidarity as women. And I wanted to put some of that in there.
No, and I agree, because I think it's a fairly universal thing that a lot of women face, really, wherever you're from. You always have to be so perfect. And it's something that I find that is a burden of women everywhere, because I see a lot of imperfect men who are forgiven for a lot of things, but not necessarily the women.
Well, and going back to the whole conceit of the women disguising their children as boys. So this actually is a practice. It was taking place in Afghanistan when the Taliban were in charge, that a lot of women were trapped in their houses and they couldn't get things that they needed. So they would disguise their girls as boys, and they would go out and go to the bazaar and do all the things that they needed to do, bring home food or whatever. And they had the freedom of being, in this disguise. And I thought it was such a profound way of subverting gender that was so different from the conversations that are going on in the West about gender identity and everything. I wanted to say we have our own ways of doing this. So that, because a criticism I received in Before She Sleeps was, there are no trans people, there's no queer people, and I just wanted to be like, you know what? This system is so suffocating that it almost doesn't matter what your own identities and desires are, because you are only meant to serve that system. Nobody cares. So in this book, I thought, well, why don't I take this sort of cultural practice that has evolved because of patriarchy and the necessity to save and survive, and why not talk about this whole debate in a way that is relevant to us and to our conversations and our milieu and our environment. So that was sort of the choice that I made there.
No, and I think a lot of people also, they kind of ignore the fact that the patriarchy does work against queerness in a very real way, because, in Before She Sleeps, you talk about how what is considered actually illegal and, people can have the death penalty for it is male-on-male sexual violence. But there's no mention of female sexual violence. And it's because it's been erased. They just don't think it's a problem or even a thing, because a woman is only valuable for her womb, right?
Do you mean female violence or female relationships?
Female relationships and female sexual violence against each other.
I mean, we know that tends to be discounted anyway, just because, it's women. What could they possibly do? But that's also kind of a loophole where a lot of queer people live with some measure of guardedness and discretion, because that is ignored. It's not given as much attention. So there's space. Constricted space, but space still. When you're a novelist, you don't set out and say, I'm going to talk about this and I'm going to talk about queerness and I'm going to, say something very profound about it. You can't think like that. What you do is just try to make your characters as authentic as they can be. And that's why the women in the army and the Hamiyat, and they're all women, and some of them have crushes on each other and they develop relationships. And that's something very common that happens in same-sex environments.
Yeah.
I just wanted to just make it seem like, well, this is kind of what does happen, and leave the morality out of it. So I was just exploring all these things. But, in the West, they want you to be so literal. They want you to say, this character is trans, and this character is queer, and this one is this, and that one is that. And I just wanted to say, well, you know what? What if we don't say these things, but we still live them?
And I think that also raises an important point about the Western gaze, really, in a lot of sci-fi and fantasy and any writing. I guess consciously or subconsciously, we're all looking to them for literary guidance.
Yeah.
That I enjoyed very much about both books is it's not just about on-the-ground things. It was also about the system of powers and how difficult it is to resist them. And how, by trying to circumvent them, sometimes you can also just be as bad as them. Could you tell me a bit about the political side of this? What made you want to show that bit as well?
I mean, thank you for picking up on that, because I think that I have been very interested in politics from a young age. And I have been very interested in the idea of women and power and women and politics, and what do women do when they're in power? And this idealistic idea that if women ruled the world, there would never be wars. And I'm just like, yeah, give me a break. Power is power. And power does something to everybody, male or female. And you just have to look at, there's so many examples in history of women who get to these top positions and they're ruthless. They're absolutely ruthless. So I wanted to explore that. Women, when they get to powerful positions, how do they maintain their principles or their integrity? Or do they actually not have any principles, and that's how they get to power in the first place? So I was exploring a lot of these questions. I am fascinated by women in positions of power because, I mean, historically, and women are always written in such subordinate ways. And in this book, men are just props. The action is going on with the women, the power struggles, the love stories, the domination, the fighting, the living, the dying. That's all being done by women. And I think it's a very heady world to encounter if you're reading this and you're very aware of gender realities and gender politics as they stand today. I want to portray people as how I perceive them. When I look at somebody, I always look at what they're saying and then what they're doing and then what their motivations are and where's the disconnect. And that if you look at it like that, you can see so many disconnects between the way people talk about themselves, the world, their position in the world, and how they act. So in the male characters in Before She Sleeps, I was looking at them like in the feminist view, all men are the oppressor. All men are the patriarchy. All men are misogynists. All men are rapists. And I'm not new to this. And I've been, studying feminism and studying feminist women's movements since I was in college. So this isn't a new phenomenon for me. But I was looking at it and I'm interrogating it. Is that true? Let's make some men up. Let's put them in these roles, hero, villain, and let's see what's really underneath those suits of armor. And I'm really big into the vulnerability of men as well, because that's something all men talk to me about this. They're like, you don't understand how hard it is. You don't understand the pressures on us as men to have feelings and sensitivities and emotions, and yet be completely trashed and ridiculed if we ever show them, not just by other men, but by women as well. I so want to go beyond the surface and be like, what's it really like being a man? Where does it hurt? Where do you feel frightened and whatever? And how do you cover that up as a man, as opposed to how do I cover that up as a woman? Or do I even have to cover that up? So the men in Before She Sleeps were kind of in that petri dish of my imagination, and those experiments were being performed on them. And I feel like I came out with compelling characters. And, some people read Before She Sleeps and they were like, I don't like this because you're being really sympathetic to the men. And I'm like, if I had just written straight villains, that would be boring too. But the hero guy, he's so boring because he's saving a woman, and that's just so typical. And it's so, where's the power for the women? And I'm just like, facepalm.
I'd argue actually he's the character with the least amount of agency. I was kind of like, oh man, you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into.
Well, that's the thing. I think young men, too, they're looking for how to be a man. They're looking for ways to be men. And in a post-apocalyptic world, in a post-sort of religious world, a post-gender world where all the guidelines are gone, how do you actually be a man? So I think I was playing with that, too, with that character.
I wanted to also talk about technology and how it's used in this book. And what I found very interesting is how it's used in different ways in the course of both books. Like in Green City, it's used as a very oppressive force, and it is kind of a tool of the patriarchy. Whereas I feel like in the Monsoon Wars, in the mountain communities, it's kind of the women aren't allowed to access it, and it's the lack of access, which is kind of the control as well. It's the movement of women who give them back that access, right? Which I think is very interesting. And can you expand on how you wanted to use technology?
Well, my one great love is writing, and my other great love is technology. I am supremely interested in technology and computers, and at the moment, I'm actually really thinking very hard about AI and its effect on writing and storytelling. Technology is something that has democratized so much of our part of the world. And technology, like a woman having a mobile phone in her hand is in Pakistan, it's probably the biggest revolution that we can think of, because all of a sudden she has access to the wider world, and she has the ability to check what she's being told about herself and about the world and about life and see for herself, is it true? And not have to rely on the interpreters of the world, which are usually male, to tell her how things are. And I think that is how technology was intended to be used in its purest form, is the facilitator of freedom.
I love that interpretation because it's not one that we always come to, especially I think in dystopian fantasies and stuff. Often technology is the villain of the piece, really.
Yes. This is why I really like being in this part of the world, because things are raw here. We haven't had 200 years of industrialization and globalization and all that. The things that are happening here are observable and tangible and sort of quantifiable. So you can actually put mobile phones into the hands of people who are from remote villages or mountainous areas or whatever. And I would say that the internet has been so major, momentous in terms of women getting access to information that isn't being interpreted through a male filter is so important. Because all of a sudden, a man's telling a woman, well, the Quran says it's okay to beat your wife. And she's like, but wait a second, this scholar says this and this scholar says that. And he's being challenged all of a sudden. And there's nothing more dangerous to male authority than a female challenge of it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that comes through very clearly in the book as well. Even when we're looking outside of, the green city and the mountains, and you're looking at a completely different country, which is Semisha. And even there, even though they have like this very high-ranking female politician who's trying her best to kind of ensure that this insurgency sees its way through and like women take back their power in the green city. At the end of it, what really happens is that unfortunately she still has to adhere to a kind of patriarchal system. Like she can't escape it, even though she has all these great dreams.
Well, I'm glad you bring that up, because one of the major tensions in that part of the book is that are her motivations pure or not? Does she really want to see women freed in Monsoon? Is she doing this as a way of gaining more power and influence herself, which is the big question that we all asked ourselves when Afghanistan was invaded. And the reason was given that, the women are being oppressed. But are you really that concerned, or is this just another way for you to exert some power and control? I really wanted that to come up.
I think what you said earlier about this kind of idea that if the world was run by women, everything would be perfect. And you're also not taking into consideration that women are also imperfect beings. And like, as you said, power is power. It's addictive and people tend to lose themselves in it.
I think the minute we start assigning moral positions to people based on their sexuality or their gender, then you've had it. Then you have lost the plot. We are all still human, and humans behave in predictable ways. And regardless of, you can take a woman and you can put her into a C-suite and she's going to be as cutthroat and ambitious and hard-headed as any man, because that's what she has to be, because that's what the role demands. Now, is that a subversion of who she is as a woman or her femininity? I don't know. I mean, we keep asking these questions. I think that, essentially, when you're having to make the tough decisions, you kind of have to make them as a person, not as a man or as a woman.
And I think also a lot of what we see as masculinity and femininity varies so differently culture to culture. What is feminine? What is feminine? I mean, I don't think everyone has the same answer when you come down to it. And so much of this is so arbitrary and so set by the way we were brought up.
Femininity as a concept is always evolving. I think it's always evolving. But I think the writer can be on the side of men, can be on the side of women, but the writer has to be on the side of humanity. That transcends these issues. Yes, it's important to talk about what's happening to women. My books are very women-oriented, women-focused relationship between men and women, power dynamics between men and women. But overall, I have to have the firm idea that these are human beings and that I, as the creator of this world and the imaginer of this world, I want this world to be a place where there is fairness, where there is justice, where there is equity. So I think you take those desires of your own and infuse your world with aspirations toward those ideals. Everybody has their own idea of what the world should look like and what world they feel safer in. So I think if you ask those questions when you're writing, then you get an idea of what a world could look like through my eyes, which is going to look different to what the world looks like through your eyes. And that's what makes writing so great, because there's so many combinations, so many iterations. There's no one answer, unlike a religion or a religious book where there's only one answer. But in writing, you can explore all of the possibilities.
Before we kind of wrap things up, I did want to ask you about these different kind of countries that have sprung up in the wake of what I understand is a nuclear war. When I read that, I was then immediately confused as to what the geographical landscape looked like. And I'm glad you included a map.
Yeah, my editor was like, you need a map.
Yeah, because I was kind of like, where are we? Like now these new technological and economic empires have risen up to kind of fill that void.
Confederations. Federations, to me, in my opinion, the future looks like federations and confederations rather than nation states. And if you look at the map, I have reimagined what the Middle East is going to look like, very much along the lines of, I think, the power struggles that are happening today. I think we're seeing the death of the Arab nation state. And what we are going to start seeing now is more alliances, trade alliances, countries that get together on common interests and common visions rather than identity and nationality.
Yeah, because I mean, as the book progresses, you realize you have all these people from very different, like, I guess, origin countries or races, and then they're all kind of put together in this insane system. And there are references to people who were brought here from different countries and now they're stuck in the system. And I mean, and then there's also references to the fallout of nuclear war, which is, you know, mass spread of disease and like obviously a huge number of casualties and death and things like that. So in a very real way, it's a post-apocalyptic world. And there is an aspect of like climate fiction to this, I would think.
Yeah, yeah. And not necessarily was I thinking I'm going to write a sci-fi novel, but it just, you know, when you're building a world, all the aspects come into play. Everything, the terrain, the geography, the environment, the climate, the, you know, how are people surviving in these conditions? Does the radioactive fallout do something to our DNA? Yes. If yes, what is that? Oh, it's the super convenient form of cervical cancer that kills all the women, so I can do my thought experiment. You know, you're doing a lot of gymnastics and trying to contrive things and make it look natural at the same time. It's really hard. I don't recommend it.
I really found it interesting that it was cervical cancer because that is a really specific thing. I usually think of like post-nuclear war as heavy radiation, people growing extra limbs, that kind of horror story.
It would be a very different kind of book.
Yes. So when I read that, I was like, I mean, the minute you read it, you're like, oh, I know that this is going to be bad. It's going to go somewhere completely different from where I expected it to. Before we sign off, I just wanted to ask, are you working on anything else? I mean, other than the third book, which, you know, I'll send you my ideas.
Yes, I would very much appreciate them. I actually just recently put together two collections. One is a collection of short stories that I've written in the past 5 or 6 years. And that's actually available as an ebook on my friend's book platform, The Little Book Company. The second collection is a sort of a retrospective of the last 10 years of my feminist and women's centered nonfiction. And I'm looking for a publisher for that, but that is what I want to have come out to sort of cap what has been a very productive 10 or 12 years of thinking, writing, living very deeply as a woman in South Asia, in Pakistan, and what are the things that have happened and what I have seen. So it's a non-academic look at the women's rights movement in Pakistan and a little bit beyond. And I would be delighted if that gets published in the next year or two.
Both of those sound amazing. I can't wait to read them. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on Arcx. I'm so genuinely thrilled that we got to have this chat, and I look forward to reading your work in the future.
Thank you. It's been fabulous talking to you, and thanks to the team for putting this all together.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Arcx is a mini-series from the Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine, or visit darkandlight.com for episode details and show notes.